On the morning of November 29th, 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who were camped along Sand Creek in the Colorado Territory were maliciously attacked by a military force of the United States Colorado Volunteers. Several of the peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were brutally murdered. Over 230 Native Americans lost their lives, which led to this tragic event officially being declared a massacre. Unfortunately, this horrific event was mainly caused by two powerful leaders in the Methodist Episcopal Church. The first was the governor of Colorado Territory, John Evans. The second was a Methodist minister, Colonel John Chivington. So join us on this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast as we explore this tragic event and talk about how these figures in Methodism were involved. Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist Podcast, a podcast where we talk about why the church is still relevant for us today as we explore themes connected to religion, politics, pop culture, faith, and yes, even the church. Together we can find out what it means to live into the mission of the church by making disciples. Now, let's get methodical. Hello everyone, I am your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and I'm excited to spend this time on the podcast today. If you like this show, I hope that you might take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps to boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can find me on Instagram as well at methodicalpod. So be sure to check me out. Before we start the podcast today, I do want to offer this word of warning. Some parts of this podcast may be difficult to hear. Listener discretion is advised. I want to thank my father-in-law, Chris, for suggesting this topic for the podcast. I think this is a really important and a really tragic story that should be told more often. And there's really a long and complex history that led up to this event of the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. A lot of the conflict between white American settlers and the Native Americans was really centered around land. Who owned what land? In 1851, the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, along with several other Native American tribes throughout North America, signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the United States government. And this treaty essentially recognized the Native Americans' claim and right to their land, which for the Cheyenne and Arapaho was this area which included southeastern Wyoming, southwestern Nebraska, eastern Colorado, and the western portions of Kansas. So it was a pretty large amount of land. So this treaty with the United States government pretty much acknowledged that all the land covered by this treaty was Native American territory, and the United States government did not have any claim to any part of it. And in exchange, the Native Americans guaranteed safe passage for Oregon Trail settlers to pass through their land. So it was kind of a give and take. But then in 1859, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush hit, and as a result, Colorado began developing very, very rapidly. During this time, over 100,000 people traveled west in search for gold. And so this led to a huge disruption of the land that was already claimed by the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Miners began building towns on this land that was already spoken for. And some of the Colorado territorial officials tried to pressure the federal government into redefining and renegotiating the Native Americans' claim to this land. In February of 1861, A.B. Greenwood, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, negotiated a new treaty called the Treaty of Fort Wise, and only a fraction of the chiefs signed this one. 6 chiefs of the Cheyenne people signed this treaty, including Black Kettle, White Antelope, Lean Bear, Little Wolf, and Tall Bear. And 4 chiefs of the Arapaho people signed this treaty, including Little Raven, Storm, Shavehead, Big Mouth, and Left Hand. And this was an absolutely terrible treaty because it dramatically, and I mean dramatically, reduced the size of their land to this little desolate patch of sand in Colorado. And when I say desolate, I mean there was no buffalo, there was no fishing, there was nothing. It was less than 1/13 the size of their original territory that was recognized in the 1851 treaty. Now, these people were confined to this tiny piece of land that was called Sand Creek. Now, the Cheyenne warriors, known as the Dog Soldiers, denounced this treaty. They spoke out against the chiefs who had signed it, and they continued to go against the constraints of this new treaty. They continued to go out and hunt bison in Colorado and Kansas, and they became increasingly more aggressive as they tried to protect this land that was rightfully theirs to begin with. And as they did this, tensions continued to rise, and this eventually led to a murder of a number of civilians, the destruction of livestock and crops, supplies being cut off, and the settlers in Denver, Colorado being in danger of starvation. So now there is a full-blown war that has broken out between the Native American tribes and the American settlers. And this is also during the time of the American Civil War. So during this time, there was an organization of military forces in the Colorado Territory, but they were all focused on fighting the rebels in the South. So there was hardly any protection being offered to these settlers who were being attacked by some of these Dog Soldiers. And so this is where Governor John Evans and Colonel John Chivington come into the story. John Milton Chivington was born in Ohio on January 27, 1821, to his father Isaac Chivington and his mother Jane Runyon. His parents were both Irish and Scottish immigrants who had traveled to America. In 1842, John Chivington was converted during a Methodist revival at Zoar Church in Hamilton Township, Ohio. And Chivington quickly began to study under the leadership of a Methodist bishop in Cincinnati named Bishop Joshua Soule. Another likely mentor might have been the Reverend Michael Marley, who was a very well-respected minister also. Then in September 1844, Michael Marley licensed Chivington to preach at Zoar Church. He then later officially became a member of the Illinois Annual Conference, and then later transferred to the Missouri Conference. And there he was ordained a deacon in 1851 at St. Joseph Mission in the Missouri Conference. And in 1852, he was ordained an elder in the Missouri and Arkansas Conference, serving the Savannah and St. Joseph Mission in the Platte Mission District. Then in 1853, he was assigned to Wyandotte, Delaware, in the Shawnee Indian Mission. This was a difficult assignment considering the churches in this area had already split over the issue of slavery. And apparently Chivington quickly became a very prominent member of this community. He was a member of the Mason group there and was named Worshipful Master. It shows that he really had a lot of influence in that area. And he also became the secretary of the Missouri Conference as well. And Chivington spoke out as a proponent of organizing the Methodist Church for the Republican Party. Apparently, on one occasion, there was a mob of about 80 people that was determined to tar and feather people, and him as well. And in response, Chivington challenged the mob by taking off his coat and threatening to whip anyone who wanted to fight after he had finished his sermon. And supposedly, he would even draw 2 pistols from his coat, lay them on the pulpit next to his Bible, and say, "By the grace of God and these 2 revolvers, I'm going to preach here today." And supposedly, that was enough to make people leave him alone. In response to the mass amount of people traveling to Colorado during the gold rush, Chivington found himself eventually serving as a minister in Denver, Colorado. Chivington really appealed to the miners. As one person noted, hundreds on the mountainside stand listening to his eloquence, who have not listened to a sermon in their natural lives, except when they were boys. In 1861, however, recruitment for the 1st Colorado Volunteer Regiment began, and Chivington was recruited. At first, he was offered the position of a chaplain, but he refused, saying, "I feel compelled to strike a blow in person for the destruction of human slavery, and to help in some measure to make this a truly free country. Therefore, I must respectfully decline an appointment as a non-combatant officer, and at the same time urgently request a fighting commission instead." So Chivington would preach on Saturdays and Sundays, and he would drill troops as a regimental major during the rest of the week. He went on to lead a very successful campaign against the Confederates at Apache Canyon. He had a very, very successful military career and was almost promoted to general. But kind of a bizarre side story, his recommendation was revoked after it was revealed that Chivington was involved in a plot to assassinate the former Chief Justice of Colorado while he was en route to New Mexico, and so he was never to receive his general straps. So that's just kind of a strange detail that goes along with this story. But like John Chivington, John Evans was also born in Ohio. He was born on March 9, 1814, to his Quaker parents, David and Rachel Evans. He was educated in Quaker schools as a young boy. Then, in August 1834, he entered Hicksite Academy in Richmond, Indiana. But after only one term, his father insisted that he return home. But eventually, he did enter Cincinnati College's medical school in the fall of 1836. Then he graduated on March 3, 1838, was married to Hannah Canby in December 1838, and he began practicing medicine in Attica, Indiana, in July 1839. Despite all of this, though, Evans was facing financial difficulties, and he had become disenchanted with the Quaker faith. During this time, he heard Bishop Matthew Simpson preach, and Evans was very, very impressed. Then Evans attended a love feast, which led him to say, "It made such an impression on my mind that I joined the church and have been a Methodist ever since." So Evans soon became a very successful businessman and philanthropist, and he suffered a very sad event when his wife Hannah died on October 9, 1850, leaving Evans completely devastated. Evans had made some early investments in real estate and the railroad, which increased his wealth even more. And then on August 1853, he married again to Margaret Gray, who was the daughter of a Methodist lawyer and ship owner in Maine. Evans was an opponent of slavery, and he worked to support Lincoln and the Republican Party, much like Chivington did. Evans eventually, though, became the governor of the Colorado Territory in 1862, and he tried and worked really hard to try to make Colorado a state. And even though he was a Methodist and abolitionist, Evans believed that Native Americans were savages and that they did not have souls. So when Evans had first arrived in Denver in May of 1862, he had given the matter of Native Americans and their affairs very, very little thought. But as the backlash of the Fort Wise Treaty continued to rise, Evans began to realize that this was going to provide some challenges for him. Things had come to a head after the Minnesota Massacre, where over 600 settlers were murdered by the Santee Sioux in 1862. Fear of Native Americans began to rise among white settlers because of this. And things escalated even more when on June 11, 1864, the Hungate family was killed. Nathan Ward Hungate was 29 years old, Ellen was 25, and their two daughters, Laura, who was only 2, and Florence, who was just under 5 months, were all killed. Their bodies were displayed in Denver, which fed into the fear that many white settlers were experiencing. These murders were committed by a group of Native Americans, but it should be stated, and we'll see here pretty soon, that most of the Native Americans in this area did not advocate for violence. They did not want war. In fact, when violence was done to them and to their own people, they oftentimes did not respond in violence themselves, but they would respond through raids where only livestock and cattle were taken, but no humans were actually harmed. So Governor Evans sent out a proclamation to, quote, the friendly Indians of the plains. And this proclamation warned them that there was a war coming. And if they didn't want to get involved, they should go to these designated areas of peace. Now, the only problem is that this proclamation was written in English, and it wasn't distributed very well to the tribes at all. So the majority of Native Americans had no idea that they could go to these areas to show peace and have this peace offering to avoid going into this war. There is also a very unfortunate event where one Native American chief named Lean Bear was gunned down right after having met President Lincoln. He was confronted by a troop of soldiers, and he was actually riding out to go meet them, go toward them. And as he was trying to show them the peace medal that was given to him by the president, he was trying to kind of show them, hey, this is okay, we don't want to fight, I'm trying to make peace. But he was shot down along with another chief that was with him named Starr. And the soldiers ran their horses over their bodies and then shot them again. Now, Chief Black Kettle was a peace chief, and he advocated for peace. But violence from the dog soldiers does occur later in response to this in August on the Overland Trail, where 53 settlers are killed there. And by the summer of 1864, settlers were being raided so much that they were forced to abandon their farms and seek refuge in Denver. Between August and September of 1864, Evans had sent several letters to the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, to try to receive military aid, but all the military forces were already fighting on the Civil War front. But finally, after several calls for aid, Evans was given permission to form the 3rd Colorado Regiment of Volunteers, which was to be led by Colonel John Chivington. The caveat to all of this, though, is that this militia that was formed, this 3rd Regiment, could only function for 100 days total. So then the Governor Evans sends out another proclamation saying that all citizens now were authorized to go out and shoot and kill any Native Americans on site, no questions asked. And in return, they could actually go out and take whatever property that they wanted for themselves. So you can see that tensions are rising. There's a huge lack of communication, and Governor Evans is starting to make some pretty critical mistakes and decisions that are going to play a pretty big role in what is to come. Because about this time, Chief Black Kettle learned about Governor Evans' first proclamation. This is the proclamation that warned them that there was war coming. And if they didn't want to get involved, they could go to these, again, designated areas of peace. And it was reported that they were to go to Fort Lyon. So Black Kettle and some of the other chiefs wrote a letter to the commander at Fort Lyon, a man named Major Wynkoop. And they wrote him saying, we want peace, we want to talk, we actually have some white prisoners that we'll return to you as a peace offering. And so when Wynkoop received this letter, he sprung into action, especially knowing that they had these white captives. So he took about 100 troops in September 1864, and when he arrives where Black Kettle is, he's surrounded by Native American warriors that were acting like very, very aggressive toward him and his men. And it looks like he's about to be attacked and maybe even killed by these Native American warriors, but just then, Black Kettle appears. And he was able to kind of make the Native American warriors settle down. And then Black Kettle and Wynkoop kind of go off together and they meet. And turns out Wynkoop was very, very impressed with Black Kettle, because Black Kettle had essentially saved his life. He kind of changed his opinion about Native Americans, that they weren't savages, that they were smart and could reason and talk and have a conversation. So Wynkoop makes this deal with Black Kettle, and they kind of become friends in a way, and And Winecoop accompanied Black Kettle and some of the other chiefs, including White Antelope and Bull Bear, to meet in Denver. And he kind of facilitates this meeting with Governor Evans and Colonel John Chivington, and they try to kind of create this pathway for peace. But Evans was reportedly very upset about this. He thought it was too late. He had already established this 3rd Regiment. He didn't want to go back on his word. He didn't want to seem weak. He didn't want people to think that he was too soft on the Native Americans. He was more concerned about what people would think of him than the possibility of making peace. But he does finally agree to meet with them. So on September 28th, 1864, they meet together at Camp Weld. At the meeting, Chief Black Kettle comes forward and says, "All we ask is that we make peace with the whites. That's all we want." He actually says, "You are our father. We've been traveling through a cloud. The sky has been dark ever since the war began." And he said he was willing to surrender. He was willing to bring peace by taking his people to Fort Lyon. And the other chiefs that were with Black Kettle agreed to do the same thing. In response, Evans accuses the Native Americans of being the ones who initiated all the hostilities. He even says, "The time when you can make war best is in the summertime. When I can make war best is in the winter. You so far have had the advantage. My time is just coming." At the meeting, Chivington said, "My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms and submit to military authority." They are nearer to Major Winecoop than anyone else, and they can go to him when they get ready to do that. So he was essentially saying, surrender to military forces and then we can talk about peace. And the chiefs again agreed to do this. They said, "We will go to Fort Lyon and we will report to Major Winecoop." So the chiefs left the meeting feeling like they could find peace by going to Fort Lyon, and that's what they did. That's where they went. Hundreds of Cheyennes and Arapahoes went and made camp outside of Fort Lyon in order to find peace. During the fall of 1864, Winecoop started providing these Native Americans that were camped outside of Fort Lyon with food and supplies. Black Kettle and his people settled just 40 miles from Fort Lyon at a place called Sand Creek. But he would go and come and meet with Winecoop very regularly. Eventually, word got out that Winecoop was giving food to the Native Americans, and he was removed from his post at Fort Lyon because of it. And he was replaced with a new commander. But interestingly enough, the new commander started feeding the Native Americans too, after seeing the peaceful relationship that had been established there. But after only a few weeks of this, the commander told Black Kettle that he could not continue to feed them anymore, and that they were to go back to Sand Creek and to wait for further instruction. Meanwhile, John Evans and John Chivington are realizing that their 100-day timeline of militia is about to run out. At this point, they had pretty much done no fighting at all. So Chivington decided to take some action before these 100 days were up. In late 1864, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, led by Colonel John Milton Chivington, marched down to Fort Lyon. They knew that the Native Americans near Fort Lyon were peaceful, but Chivington was determined to make a move against them anyway. On November 28, 1864, Chivington arrived at the fort completely unannounced, and he barred all the exits, not allowing anyone to leave the fort. The officers at Fort Lyon told Chivington that they had established peace with the Native Americans there, but Chivington responded by saying, "Damn any man who is in sympathy with Indians." After marching all night, on November 29, 1864 at dawn, Chivington and his 100-day men arrived at this Native American camp at Sand Creek. He was armed with 700 troops, armed with shotguns, pistols, and mountain howitzers. There were around 115 teepees in Sand Creek with about 500 men, women, and children. Most of the men had left. They were not part of this encampment. They had gone out hunting and gone to other places, but only 75 of those present at Sand Creek were men. The rest were women, children, and the elderly. They were hoping for peace. In fact, over his lodge, Black Kettle was even flying a U.S. flag with a white flag marking peace tied just beneath it. But despite all of this, Chivington and his army came in from the south, and some of the Native Americans even went out to meet him, thinking that they might be able to talk to him, kind of talk him down. But Chivington and his men dismounted from their horses, and they began going through the village, and they started shooting. And at that point, people took off running while shots were being fired all around them. It was chaos. Chivington and his soldiers then began pursuing the fleeing Native Americans, chasing them for several miles. All in all, the battle lasted from dawn until about 3 o'clock that afternoon. Now, I don't know if we can really call this a battle. Again, this was deemed a massacre. But the American soldiers did take some casualties. They had 76 casualties, 25 killed, 51 wounded. The Native Americans, however, lost around 150 of their people. After the battle is where a lot of the horrific events took place. The white soldiers began to seek out further vengeance. They unfortunately scalped and mutilated a lot of the Native American bodies. It's kind of horrific when you read about it. However, 2 companies that consisted of about 100 of the soldiers refused to ever fire their weapons to begin with. These companies were led by Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. Soule and Kramer detailed a lot of the crimes that took place by these soldiers during this horrific event. Silas Soule was the first witness that was called during the investigation at Sand Creek, and Joseph Kramer was the second witness. Sand Creek became the most investigated event that occurred during the Civil War. And sadly, Silas Soule was actually later assassinated because of his testimony during this investigation. So a huge investigation did take place because of this massacre. And in a congressional testimony, one observer said, "I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops." In 1879, in the New York Tribune, a man named Robert Brent wrote, "I saw one squaw lying on the bank, whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open, with an unborn child lying by her side." Also in the New York Tribune, a man named Major Anthony stated, "There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, 'Let me try to shoot him. I can hit him.' He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him. Third man came up, made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped." Another observer named Stan Hogue said, "Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of white antelope lying solitarily in the creek bed was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles, the last for a tobacco pouch. A man named Kit Carson wrote to Colonel James Rusling saying, "Just to think of that dog Shivington and his dirty hounds up there at Sand Creek. His men shot down squaws and blew the brains out of little innocent children. You call such soldiers Christians, do you? And Indians savages? What do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both of them and us, think of these things?" Miraculously, in this battle, Chief Black Kettle survived, and he survived even after having gone back to save his wounded wife. Now, after this horrific tragedy, the soldiers in Colorado were praised in Colorado. But many of the Americans back east were horrified to hear about this massacre that had taken place at Sand Creek. President Abraham Lincoln actually removed Governor Evans from his post, and Shivington resigned from the military service because he could not be punished by the military for what he did at the massacre if he resigned from his position. Neither John Evans or John Shivington ever apologized for their actions at Sand Creek. But the Methodist response to this atrocity was also practically non-existent. When investigators began surrounding this massacre, a group of Colorado ministers publicly endorsed Colonel Shivington and his attack. Also, prominent Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson advocated for Governor Evans to keep his job. Another Methodist bishop, Calvin Kingsley, warned against people having a sentimental view of Native Americans. And the Methodist press strongly supported Governor Evans. In the end, the Methodist Church never called Shivington or Evans to account for their roles in the Sand Creek massacre. For the most part, these two figures remained heroes in Colorado. Gary Roberts, who is the author of The Massacre at Sand Creek, made a statement about this massacre to the 2016 General Conference of the United Methodist Church. In his statement, he said the following: "I know that what happened at Sand Creek was terribly wrong. What I need to understand is why it happened and what lessons may be learned from it. It is not by chance that this study leaves hard questions unanswered. That is a way of knowledge. While the United Methodist Church's response to this report is not for me to decide, I hope that there are lessons to be found here that will help the church not only to come to grips with the past, but also to find a sacred way to what is right and just in dealing with all people everywhere." He goes on to say, "Early in the attack on the village at Sand Creek, a woman was struck by soldier bullets as she ran up the creek with family members and friends. As she fell, dying, into the sand, she shouted to those fleeing around her, 'Don't forget us.'" Gary Roberts ends his report saying, "That is my admonition to you. Listen, learn, and do not forget." Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.